Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. America has mass deported illegals 3 times in the past 100 years. As the clock ticks down on number 4, it's worth asking what happened last time around. Now, this may shock MSNBC, but in fact, in every mass deportation, Americans somehow manage to mow the lawn, pick the fruit, and even pick up the kids from daycare. The first thing to note is that deportations are happening all the time under every president. The media will pretend that deportation is some medieval torture from a bygone era, but in fact, Bill Clinton deported 12 million people, George W. Bush deported 10 million, even Obama and Biden combined for 5 million deportations. In other words, mass deportation is totally normal. Still, 3 times in the past century, the federal government has made a special effort to mass deport illegal migrants. The first was in the 1910s after World War I. The war itself brought hundreds of thousands of refugees, and many were political refugees with radical political beliefs. In modern terms, they were terrorists who had crossed an open border. Remember, this is an era of widespread political assassinations, generally by Europe-born radicals like the anarchist who killed William McKinley, or the Bavarian who shot Teddy Roosevelt. The bullet was famously stopped by Roosevelt's folded 50-page speech because Roosevelt was a man of many words. In a recent video, I talked about the second 20th century episode, the biggest deportation in U.S. history, FDR's mass deportation during the Great Depression. FDR targeted Mexican farm workers who were overloading charity and relief needed for the American victims of his Great Depression. Note, FDR's deportations included thousands of citizen children of illegals, so that is perfectly legal. The media will pretend it is not. The most salient point of FDR's deportations was that roughly 90% self-deported, partly because FDR started denying public relief to unemployed illegals, but mostly because it turns out threatening to arrest people for breaking the law makes a lot of them find a reason to go home. In all, FDR chased out between 1 and 2 million, which is about 5 million in modern terms. The third was in the 1950s under Eisenhower. This too followed a major war, a pattern since wars mean labor shortages, so companies cheat. Like FDR, Eisenhower conducted raids across the country using military-style tactics and ultimately deported up to 1 million. Media was used to amplify the operation. Remember, this was an era where media did exactly what it was told. The amplification ramped up self-deportations, which is easier for everybody. Note, in none of these episodes did farming or manufacturing collapse. Employers found plenty of workers, they just had to pay more. Now, it's true GDP did drop by 0.5% in 1954, followed by 7.1% growth in the following year. So what's next? The left will pretend that mass deportation is cruel, that it will destroy the economy, and that it will be impossibly expensive. In fact, every country on earth deports illegals. Mexico deports Guatemalans, Syria deports Yemenis, China deports Tajiks. Is the way of the world. Every country decides who to admit, and most will arrest you if you sneak in. As for the economy, mass deportation doesn't destroy anything, it just raises wages. Given surveys repeatedly find most Americans are perfectly happy to pay more for an American-made product, and given the prices are more than compensated by lower crime, lower welfare costs, I suspect most Americans are just fine with that. Donald Trump wants to lower taxes on blue-collar workers. The left is now claiming it will destroy Social Security. Just 1 week into Trump 2.0, failing left-wing media is ramping up the attacks that a smaller government will leave grandma eating cat food, part of their concerted gaslight to paint everything Trump does as either chaos, cruel, or a little of both. Their latest target is Trump's blue-collar tax cuts. As Newsweek puts it, quote, Trump plan may speed up Social Security insolvency. For CNN, it was, quote, Trump has not explained how he would protect Social Security, as in protect from what? U.S. News just goes straight black pill with, quote, here's how much you could lose if Social Security goes bankrupt. Their argument is that Donald Trump's blue-collar tax cuts, so no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security benefits, means that less money would be going into Social Security. Less money going in means the so-called Social Security Trust Fund runs out faster, so theoretically 2031 instead of 2035. Of course, lower taxes tend to boost growth, which can actually raise the Social Security take, But the larger issue is that the trust fund is a myth. In reality, Social Security has always been bankrupt. It was born bankrupt. The reason is, out of the tens of trillions Social Security taxes took, not one penny was ever set aside. Instead, every last dollar was immediately spent by Congress on whatever wars, welfare, and donor rewards they could pinch, all replaced by government IOUs. The IOUs are the so-called trust fund. The formal name for this is pay-as-you-go system, as in you pay $1 and out it goes. It also means there is zero economic link between how much Social Security collects in taxes and how much it spends. They both get tossed into a giant pot of money that Congress wastes. This is important because the left uses Social Security fear porn to attack any tax cut that would benefit the working people who overwhelmingly pay Social Security taxes. So if the trust fund is a myth, it means Social Security bankruptcy is a myth, or more accurately, Social Security is both a tax and a benefits program, and the two are completely separate. As in, you could have a big tax and big benefits, you could have no tax and big benefits, you could have anything in between. So what's next? We do have a fiscal crisis in Washington, but it is not grandma's Social Security that's causing it. It's the hundreds of billions in waste and fraud to corporate donors, political activists, and foreign masters. I've mentioned in recent videos how the left will pretend every spending cut must come from firemen, national parks, and Social Security. In fact, there's so much fat and fraud to cut from federal spending that we can afford both blue-collar tax cuts and full Social Security payments. Unless, of course, a rogue Congress decides to teach the American people a lesson using grandma as the human shield. A word from our lead sponsor, Unchained.com. In the new year, it's time to think about your annual IRA contributions. An IRA is an investment vehicle that can save you a lot of taxes. And with Unchained, you can hold real Bitcoin in your IRA, get access to trading, inheritance, and loans, and it's the only company where you hold the keys and can verify that your Bitcoin is not being relent like banks do. We've seen futures-based ETFs underperform holding your own Bitcoin, so why settle for less? Book a friendly consultation at unchained.com/Peter. You've heard me talk about the need to protect yourself from inflation and central bank currency debasement. Instead of parking your wealth and eroding dollars, there's an alternative: saving and earning interest every month in gold and silver with monetary metals. Gold and silver owners can earn between 2 and 4% on metal leases paid in more ounces of gold and silver. Accredited investors can earn up to 19% in monetary metals, precious metal bond offerings. That's real, tangible wealth earning interest every month. This is more than just preserving your wealth. This is growing it in gold and silver that cannot be devalued by the Fed. Visit monetarymetals.com/Peter to learn how to put your gold and silver to work today. Now back to our show. The socialist government of Colombia volunteered to be the first country humiliated by Donald Trump's unwillingness to let America get walked on by every random country on Earth. The beef kicked off when Colombia refused to accept their own criminal aliens on a repatriation flight, suggesting Colombia had not, in fact, been sending their best, but this also violates long-standing arrangements that countries have to accept their deported criminals. Trump, in between golf holes, informed Colombia's socialist president he would be imposing sanctions and tariffs potentially hitting 50%. In response, as ex-user Maze Moore put it, the president of Colombia wrote a dissertation on the history of his country and his bloodline and how it would be impossible for him to ever back down. 1 hour later, he did back down, after Trump had tariff legislation drafted for the House and Senate and posted a FAFO meme for good measure. Now, Colombia was dumb to pick the fight in the first place, not only because refusing their own criminals is bad form, but because Colombia needs the U.S. one heck of a lot more than the U.S. needs Colombia. For starters, in the past 8 years, Colombia's gotten about $800 million a year in U.S. aid, but the real dependence is, of course, trade. So Colombia exports roughly 7% of their GDP to the U.S., with the U.S. making up 41% of all of Colombia's exports. That means roughly 3 million Colombians feed their family by exporting to the U.S. things like flowers, bananas, spices, and, of course, coffee. For the U.S., meanwhile, Colombia is just 0.8% of exports, so it is noise. Now, I've mentioned in previous videos how this inequality is pretty much true for every country on Earth, where the U.S. market is existential for them, but their market is noise to us. That means that Colombia will lose any trade war with the U.S., Canada or Europe will lose any trade war, never mind Japan or Korea. Even China needs us much more than we need them. So to illustrate, our three biggest trade partners are Canada, Mexico, and China. Mexico's exports to the U.S. make up over a third of their economy, meaning roughly 45 million Mexicans are fed by U.S. consumers. But our exports to Mexico are just 1.3% of GDP. Canada's almost as bad. Exports to the U.S. are over 1/5 of their entire economy, so about 8 million Canadians are fed by Americans. But our exports to Canada are just 1.4% of our economy. Even for China, we export just 1/4 what they export to us as a share of the economy. So about 1 million jobs in the U.S. are producing for export to China, while 20 million Chinese jobs depend on exports to the U.S. When you tally it up, it's rather shocking that the U.S. gets pushed around at all. We are the ones with the leverage. And Trump is the first president since, Teddy Roosevelt to see that. So what's next? We're barely a week into Trump, and he's already rearranging the global order. The world has been happy to take advantage of our globalist generosity, so access to our markets, our tech, our unpaid mercenary services, all for nothing in return. In fact, the closer our alleged friendship, the more abusive they've been. Trump is ending that. More important, once it's gone, the globalists will have a very hard time taking us back to America last. Donald Trump wants to end birthright citizenship. Left-wing media and Democrats are fighting it tooth and nail because illegals, indeed criminals, are their mother's milk. Among Donald Trump's first avalanche of executive orders was one ending birthright citizenship, the policy where almost anybody born on U.S. soil automatically gets citizenship. The practice itself comes from a misreading of the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to freed slaves, specifically to, quote, all persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. The key phrase here is subject to the jurisdiction. That's long been understood to exclude diplomats, so birth alone is not enough, but jurisdiction is actually a whole lot more limiting. Historian Tom Wood cites the authors of the 14th Amendment, who said, quote, this will not, of course, include persons born in the United States who are foreigners or aliens, because it only applies to people, quote, not owing allegiance to any foreign sovereignty. In other words, if you have citizenship of another country, say Mexico, you are not under the jurisdiction according to the 14th. Why? Because the point of the 14th was to give citizenship to former slaves who held no other citizenship. Now, notably, for 50 years after the 14th, Indians were not given birthright citizenship specifically because they were citizens of another nation, the Navajo, Comanche, Seminole. And when they were given birthright citizenship, it was by act of Congress, not the 14th. Of course, not only are illegals subject to the jurisdiction of another country, they are in this country illegally. They are literally fugitives from the law, the very definition of not under the jurisdiction. Now, this all matters because so-called birthright citizenship is one of the most abused parts of our immigration system. Every year, roughly 622,000 people are born to non-citizen parents, of which 400,000 to illegals. That comes to 1 in 6 births in the country. In the case of illegals, anchor babies become a jackpot. One study found 75% of migrants from Guatemala and Mexico with children are on federal welfare programs, adding up to hundreds of billions in costs. Indeed, we've heard stories from Biden's illegals where young women in shelters tried to get knocked up by pretty much anybody to get that precious anchor baby, your tax dollars at work. The abuse extends to an estimated 40,000 so-called birth tourists who literally fly to America on vacation, give birth, and go home with the status of parents of an American citizen despite having spent mere days in the country. This is a full-on industry in China and Taiwan where pre-birthing centers are common, kind of an assisted care for pregnant women. But instead of doing it in China, they fly to a center in LA, fully staffed by Chinese, and presto, they get all the benefits of citizenship. All in, between the illegals, temporary visas like H-1Bs or students, and birth tourists, 1 in 6 new Americans either should not be here or have almost no connection to the country. So what's next? The left will go to war on this because they know the vast majority of beneficiaries will vote left. The case they'll keep citing is Wong Kim Ark from 1873, which granted citizenship to the child of permanent residents, something most Americans are probably fine with, and something that has nothing to do with these 622,000 illegals and tourists abusing the system. A word from our sponsor. If you run a business and want to get customers excited about your loyalty and rewards program, you can now implement Bitcoin rewards with Oshi Loyalty. You get all the perks of a full-featured loyalty and reward program with real Bitcoin rewards every time your customers shop, refer, and engage. Boost customer retention, loyalty, and lifetime value. And if you're looking for Bitcoin rewards when you shop, check out the dozens of companies in the Oshi marketplace at Oshi, that's OSHI.tech/shop. Start earning Bitcoin today. One of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. And one of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada and they're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. CoinKite's devices are compatible with Unchained.com, and you can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/ProfSaintAnge. That's CoinKite.com/ProfSaintAnge. Okay, back to our show. Donald Trump is doubling down on completely repealing the income tax, replacing it with tariffs on foreigners. The left, who uses the income tax to suck the blood from the American people on behalf of giant corporations, and pink-haired child mutilators are popping their little heads. Now, during the campaign, Trump had repeatedly mused, what if we just get rid of the income tax and abolish the IRS? The left was not taking him seriously because, like politicians say all kinds of stuff when they're trying to get elected. But now, with the election safely under his belt, Trump is not letting it go. In fact, he's doubling down. In an address to a major GOP policy retreat in Florida, Trump ran through the history of the tariff, how America was much richer as a country when we funded the federal government not off the blood, sweat, and tears of the American people, but off foreigners in the form of tariffs. Of course, that golden age ended in 1913 with the left's victorious imposition of an income tax that was originally promised as only hitting the top 1%, but today, of course, hits everybody. Now, I've talked about the tariffs for income tax trade-off, but in short, if you get rid of the income tax and replace it with tariffs, you're looking at a $1.5 trillion net decline in federal taxes, so you would need Elon's Doge to cut spending. In return, you would massively raise income, raise economic growth, and lower inflation. I've estimated the average American household would see something like a $30,000 rise in annual income. It's about 40%. And it comes to about $2,500 per month. About half of that would come from the taxes you no longer pay, the other half from higher economic growth, since we would no longer be taxing work or entrepreneurship. The higher growth would be what's lowering inflation, since inflation is money chasing goods, more goods, a bigger economy, means lower prices. That would easily offset whatever tariffs due to prices. Moreover, and Trump's highlighted this, an America without an income tax would be easily the most attractive country to produce on Earth. Especially paired with tariffs and regulatory cuts, which Trump is also pushing, literally every country on Earth would start trying to move production to America. China would be the one crying about rust belts. So what's next? I was giddy about a presidential candidate merely talking about ending the income tax. Now we've got a sitting president who actually wants it. Hard to overstate just how massive this is. Having said, can it happen? With Republicans controlling all three branches, absolutely. Legislatively, you just repeal the Revenue Act of 1913, stroke of a pen, the IRS is gone forever. And thanks to something called reconciliation, any bill that primarily affects revenue, which this is by definition, only needs simple majority in Congress to pass for 10 years. at which point I suspect the American people will not want an income tax they have not been paying for 10 years. In short, after generations of promising to battle for smaller government, the GOP finally has the chance to make all their promises come true. Trump wants it. The American people want it. Gallup says Americans think their taxes are too high by 15-1. The last barrier is Republicans in Congress who, in theory, serve you. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersanons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.